They were told American soldiers would strip away every ounce of dignity, that capture meant humiliation worse than death. But when 127 Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and radio operators arrived at Camp Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, September 1945, the enemy didn't force them into degradation. Instead, within 24 hours of hearing their whispered shame about communal showers, American guards hung privacy curtains in every stall. They expected cruelty. They received fabric panels and respect. For women taught that surrender meant the end of honor, this small act of decency shattered everything they believed about their enemy. If you're interested in untold stories of World War II that challenge everything you thought you knew, hit that like button and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. The USS transport ship cut through the fog of San Francisco Bay on a cool September morning in 1945. The war had ended just weeks earlier, but for the women huddled on the deck, the fighting felt far from over. Their battle was internal now, a war against shame, fear, and the propaganda that had prepared them for this moment since childhood. 127. Japanese women stood in tight clusters, their uniforms, once crisp military khaki, now wrinkled and stained from weeks of travel across the Pacific. Some wore the remnants of nursing corps attire, white bands still visible on their sleeves. Others had been radio operators, their fingers once flying across telegraph keys, now clutching thin blankets against the morning chill. A few were civilian employees who had worked in military offices across the Pacific Islands, caught in the wrong place when surrender came. They ranged in age from 19 to 45. Some had faces that still held the softness of youth, while others showed the hardness that comes from years of war. But every face shared the same expression, a mixture of exhaustion, dread, and carefully maintained composure. They had been trained not to show emotion. To show emotion was to show weakness. As the ship approached Angel Island, the women got their first real look at America. The Golden Gate Bridge rose through the fog like something from a dream, massive, orange, impossibly grand. San Francisco sprawled across the hills beyond, buildings stacked upon buildings, all untouched by bombs. No rubble, no burned-out shells, no cratered streets. The smell hit them next. Not the smell of smoke and destruction they expected, but something else entirely. Fresh paint, salt water, the faint scent of food cooking somewhere on the island. The air itself felt different, cleaner, lighter, as if the war had never reached this place. The ship's engines cut, and the vessel drifted toward the dock with a gentle bump. American sailors moved efficiently, securing lines and lowering the gangway. Their movements were casual, almost bored. This was routine for them. For the women, it was the end of everything they had known. The sound of English being shouted back and forth between the dock and the ship was jarring. The language was harsh to their ears, full of hard consonants and strange rhythms. A few of the women understood some English. They had studied it in school before the war, but most heard only incomprehensible noise. Nurse Keiko Yamamoto stood near the railing, her hand gripping the cold metal so tightly her knuckles had turned white. At 26, she had spent the last 4 years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. She had seen men die in ways that haunted her dreams. She had worked until her hands bled and her eyes could barely stay open. And through it all, she had believed in the righteousness of Japan's cause. Now she believed in nothing except the certainty of her own shame. She had been captured. She had not chosen death. According to everything she had been taught, she had dishonored herself, her family, and her nation. "They will make examples of us," whispered Fumiko, a 22-year-old radio operator who stood beside Keiko. Her voice was barely audible over the sounds of the ship. "I heard from a soldier before we left Okinawa. He said American treatment of prisoners. They do things. Terrible things." Keiko didn't respond. She had heard the same stories. Every Japanese soldier and civilian had heard them. The Americans were barbarians who showed no mercy, especially to women. Capture meant torture, humiliation, violation. It meant being stripped of every shred of dignity before death would finally come as a mercy. An American officer appeared at the top of the gangway, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face. He stood with his hands behind his back, watching as the women were organized into lines by military police. His expression was neutral, unreadable. Was that cruelty hiding behind those eyes? Or simple indifference? The women didn't know, and in their not knowing, they imagined the worst. As they were led down the gangway, each step felt like walking toward an execution. Their legs trembled. Some fought back tears, determined to maintain dignity for as long as possible. Others had already accepted their fate, their faces blank masks of resignation. Wait. The fear was overwhelming, but something felt wrong. Where were the jeering crowds? Where were the angry soldiers seeking revenge? The dock was busy but orderly. People were working, not watching. It felt almost routine. It felt nothing like what they had been prepared for. They were marched in single file up a winding path toward a cluster of white wooden buildings that sat on a flat area of the island. Angel Island had once been an immigration station, processing thousands of Asian immigrants before the war. Now it had been converted into a temporary holding facility for prisoners of war. The September sun had burned away the morning fog, and heat radiated off the white buildings. Sweat trickled down the women's backs beneath their heavy uniforms. Their feet ached from standing on the ship's deck for hours, but physical discomfort barely registered. Their minds were too consumed with fear. At the entrance to the first building, they were stopped. An American woman in military uniform stood there. A WWII officer, though the Japanese women didn't know this term. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. She held a clipboard and spoke in English to another soldier, who then turned to the group of women. "Processing," he said in heavily accented but understandable Japanese. "Medical check, delousing, change of clothes, follow." The word delousing sent a ripple of fresh panic through the group. They knew what that meant. It meant being stripped, examined, treated like cattle. It meant the beginning of the humiliation they had dreaded. Keiko felt her stomach twist into knots. She wanted to run, to fight, to do anything but walk through that door. But where would she run? They were on an island in the middle of a bay in enemy territory. There was nowhere to go. There was only forward. Inside, the building was surprisingly clean and well lit. The floors were scrubbed, the walls freshly painted. It smelled of disinfectant and soap, a clinical smell, but not an unpleasant one. The women were divided into smaller groups and led to different rooms. Keiko's group of 20 was taken to a large room with benches along the walls. The WWII officer who had been at the door followed them in, along with 2 female medics. The translator explained that they would be given medical examinations to check for illness or injury, that their clothes would be cleaned or replaced, and that they would be given the opportunity to bathe. The medical examination was thorough but professional. The medics checked eyes, ears, throats, listened to hearts and lungs. They looked for signs of disease, malnutrition, wounds that needed treatment. They spoke to each other in quiet tones, making notes on charts. They did not leer. They did not make inappropriate comments or gestures. They simply did their jobs. This confused the women more than cruelty would have. They had been prepared for monsters. These were just people, professionals doing a task. After processing, they were led to a mess hall, a long building with rows of tables and benches. The smell of food was overwhelming. Rich, heavy, abundant food. The women's stomachs clenched with hunger despite their fear. Many hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The voyage across the Pacific had offered only minimal rations. They were directed to form a line at a serving counter. Behind the counter, army cooks, both men and women, stood ready with large pots and serving utensils. The women moved forward hesitantly, clutching the trays they had been given. Keiko reached the front of the line and stared in disbelief at what was being placed on her tray. A thick slice of white bread, soft and fresh. A scoop of mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting on top. Green beans and meat, actual meat, a substantial portion of what looked like beef stew, chunks of tender meat floating in rich brown gravy. Her hands shook as she accepted the tray. Behind the counter, one of the cooks, a young man, maybe 25, gave her a brief nod and something that might have been an attempt at a reassuring smile. "Plenty more if you want seconds," he said in English. She didn't understand the words, but his tone wasn't threatening. The women carried their trays to tables and sat in silence, staring at the food. This had to be a trick. This had to be poisoned, or it was some kind of test. Perhaps they were being fattened up for some darker purpose. Or maybe this was just the last meal before execution. Fumiko, sitting across from Keiko, picked up her fork. Her hand trembled. She stabbed a piece of meat, brought it slowly to her mouth, and took a bite. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, then swallowed. Tears began to stream down her face. "It's real," she whispered in Japanese. "It's really good food." Around the table, other women began to eat. Some cried openly, unable to hold back the emotion. Others ate in silence, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and confusion. The food was better than what many of them had eaten even before the war, when supplies in Japan were still adequate. In the last year, rations had been reduced to near starvation levels. Many of these women had been subsisting on rice mixed with barley, thin soup, and whatever vegetables they could scavenge, and now the enemy, the barbarians who were supposed to torture and kill them, was feeding them like honored guests. Keiko took a bite of the mashed potatoes. The butter was rich and creamy, the potatoes smooth and perfectly seasoned. She had to put down her fork for a moment and breathe deeply, fighting the urge to sob. This wasn't just food. This was abundance. This was plenty in a world where she had known only scarcity. An American guard walked slowly through the mess hall, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He looked bored, not angry. When his eyes passed over the women, there was no cruelty there, just mild curiosity. He stopped to pour himself a cup of coffee. From a large urn near the wall, took a sip and continued his rounds. The contradiction was dizzying. These were supposed to be their tormentors, but they were acting like guards at a regular military facility, doing a job, nothing more, nothing less. After the meal, they were taken to their barracks. The buildings were long and rectangular, with rows of beds on either side. Each bed had a mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets, all clean, all in good condition. There were windows that let in natural light and fresh air. The floors were wooden but well maintained and swept clean. It was not luxury, but it was far from the hell they had imagined. It was, in fact, better than the accommodations many of them had known during their military service. Field hospitals and forward operating bases rarely had such comfort. Each woman was assigned a bed. As they moved through the barracks choosing their spaces, they did so in near silence, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. This had to be temporary. The real treatment would come later. This was just to make them comfortable before the cruelty began. Keiko chose a bed near a window where she could see out across the bay toward the city. She sat down on the mattress, testing it. It was firm but not uncomfortable. The pillow was filled with real stuffing, not just rags. The blankets were wool, thick and warm. A WWII officer entered the barracks with the translator. She explained through him that they would be allowed to keep personal items that weren't dangerous. They would be given toiletries, soap, toothbrushes, combs. They would have scheduled times for meals, for exercise in the yard, and for bathing. They would be expected to keep their areas clean and to follow the rules of the camp, but they would not be mistreated. The officer's voice was firm but not harsh. She looked at them with something that might have been sympathy. "I know you're scared," she said through the translator, "but you're safe here. We follow the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with the respect due to prisoners of war." Geneva Convention. Most of the women had heard of it but didn't fully understand what it meant. They had been told that international law was a Western fantasy, that in real war there were no rules, only victory and defeat. But here was an American officer telling them they had rights, that there were rules, that they would be respected. It was too much to process. Keiko lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt the weight of the day crushing down on her. Nothing made sense. Everything she had been taught, everything she believed, was being challenged by this strange reality. That night, as darkness fell over the island and the lights in the barracks were dimmed, the women whispered to each other across the rows of beds. "What do you think they're planning?" someone asked in the darkness. "I don't know," came the reply. "But something is very wrong. This is not what we were told to expect." In the silence that followed, Keiko closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was too full of contradictions, of the clash between expectation and reality. She had been prepared for hell and found something else entirely. Something far more confusing than cruelty could ever be. The morning bell rang at 6 o'clock, echoing across the barracks. Keiko woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then the reality of where she was crashed back over her. She was a prisoner, in America, on enemy soil. The women rose and dressed in the simple clothes they had been given, plain work shirts and trousers in olive drab, similar to what American service personnel wore for manual labor. They made their beds with military precision, old habits dying hard. Then they filed out to the mess hall for breakfast. Breakfast was oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with butter, and coffee. Once again, the portions were generous. Once again, the food was good. The women ate quietly, still wary, but their bodies betrayed them with hunger. After weeks of poor rations, their stomachs demanded to be filled. After breakfast, they were divided into work details. Some were assigned to kitchen duty, helping to prepare meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing linens and clothes. A few with medical training, like Keiko, were taken to the camp infirmary to assist the American medical staff. The work was not hard labor. It was ordinary, mundane tasks. The kind of work that needed doing in any organized facility. They were supervised, but not harshly. American guards watched them, but from a distance, without aggression. It felt less like imprisonment and more like duty assignment. Keiko found herself in the infirmary working alongside a U.S. Army nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. Sarah was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and warm brown eyes. She spoke slowly and used simple English, trying to make herself understood. When words failed, she used gestures. Gradually, over the course of that first morning, a basic communication developed between them. Sarah showed Keiko where supplies were kept, how the American system of medical record-keeping worked, what protocols to follow. She treated Keiko not as a dangerous prisoner, but as a fellow medical professional who simply happened to be on the wrong side of a war. There was respect in her interactions, even a tentative friendliness. At midday, the prisoners were given lunch, sandwiches with actual meat, fruit that was fresh and abundant, cold milk to drink. They ate in the mess hall, same as before. American personnel ate in the same building, at different tables. There was separation, but not hostility. Afternoons brought more work, then a period of free time before dinner. During free time, the women were allowed to walk in a designated area of the compound, to sit outside in the sunshine, to write letters if they wished, though they were warned the letters would be censored and might not reach Japan for some time. Dinner was the largest meal of the day. Meat, vegetables, potatoes, bread, dessert, sometimes pie or cake. The abundance never stopped shocking them. How could a nation at war have so much food? Japan had been starving for years. Even before defeat, civilians were malnourished, soldiers underfed. American propaganda had claimed the U.S. was suffering, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of war. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. These were not the signs of a struggling nation. This was prosperity, even in wartime. On the third day, mail arrived for some of the women. Letters from Japan, from families who had learned their daughters, wives, sisters had survived and been taken prisoner. The letters had been censored, with portions blacked out, but enough remained to paint a picture of desperation. Fumiko received a letter from her mother. She read it aloud to Keiko in their barracks that evening, her voice cracking with emotion. "Tokyo is in ruins," her mother wrote. "The firebombing left nothing. We live in a shelter made from scraps of metal. Your father's factory was destroyed. We search for food every day. Sometimes we find vegetables growing wild. Sometimes kind neighbors share. Your brother is thin as a ghost. We are surviving, but barely. We pray you are being treated humanely. We worry so much. Please stay strong." Fumiko folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking. Around her, other women who had received similar letters sat in silence, processing the weight of the guilt. They were here, being fed 3 full meals a day, sleeping in clean beds, while their families starved in the ruins of a defeated nation. The contrast was unbearable. Keiko had not yet received a letter from her own family in Osaka, and she didn't know if that was better or worse. Not knowing allowed her to hope they were okay. But it also allowed her imagination to conjure worst-case scenarios. The guilt settled over the women like a heavy blanket. They were prisoners, yes, but they were comfortable prisoners. They were being treated better than their own nation had treated them during wartime service, and far better than their families were being treated now in occupied Japan. How could they accept this kindness when their loved ones suffered? How could they eat these meals knowing their families went hungry? Every bite of food became an act of betrayal. Every night in a warm bed felt like abandoning those they loved. The Americans seemed to notice the change in mood after the letters arrived. The guards became even gentler in their oversight, as if understanding that the women were wrestling with something beyond simple imprisonment. One evening, Keiko was working late in the infirmary, helping to organize medical supplies. Lieutenant Martinez was there as well, finishing up paperwork. They worked in companionable silence for a while, then Sarah paused and looked at Keiko directly. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. Keiko understood the words. They were simple enough. Sarah gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything. "War. Hard for everyone. Your families. I'm sorry." Keiko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The kindness in Sarah's voice, the genuine sympathy in her eyes, it was almost too much to bear. This was supposed to be the enemy, this woman whose country had dropped fire from the sky on Tokyo, whose military had defeated Japan. And here she was, expressing sorrow for Japanese suffering. The world made no sense anymore. The shower incident happened on the 4th day. It was the moment that would become the defining memory of their captivity, the story they would tell their children decades later when trying to explain what it was like to have all your beliefs about the enemy destroyed in a single act of unexpected decency. The bathing facilities at the camp were communal, large shower rooms with multiple shower heads along the walls. In military settings, communal showers were standard. Soldiers bathed together without a second thought. It was practical, efficient, and no one gave it much consideration. But for the Japanese women, this was a source of deep distress. In Japanese culture, particularly for women of their generation, privacy during bathing was deeply important. Public baths existed, yes, but they were segregated by gender, and there were certain protocols, certain respects paid to modesty. The idea of showering completely exposed in front of dozens of other women in a military facility under enemy guard was mortifying. It wasn't about physical safety. The guards were never in the shower room. Female WWII personnel supervised. It was about dignity, about maintaining some sense of self in a situation where everything had been stripped away. For the first few days, the women had endured it. They showered quickly, trying not to look at each other, trying to preserve some illusion of privacy through sheer force of will. But the discomfort was visible. Many of the women, especially the older ones, were clearly distressed. Some were crying silently while they washed. Others stood frozen, unable to make themselves proceed with the required bathing. Fumiko had been one of the most distressed. She was young, modest, and the exposure made her feel violated even though no one was actually doing anything inappropriate. On the 3rd evening, she had returned to the barracks after her shower with red eyes and wouldn't speak to anyone. She just curled up on her bed and faced the wall. Keiko had tried to comfort her. "We must endure," she whispered. "It's not forever. We must simply endure." But on the 4th day, something changed. When the women arrived for their scheduled shower time that evening, they stopped at the entrance to the bathing facility, staring in confusion. Something was different, or very different. Privacy curtains had been installed overnight. Simple canvas panels hung from metal rods, dividing the large communal shower room into individual stalls. Each shower head now had its own private space, completely enclosed except for a small gap at the bottom for drainage. The curtains could be pulled closed, giving each woman complete privacy while she bathed. The women stood there, unable to believe what they were seeing. This had to be for some other purpose. This couldn't be for them. The WWII officer supervising the shower schedule that evening was a different woman than usual. Sergeant Helen Patterson, a tall woman in her 40s with red hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She saw their confusion and spoke through the translator who had been called over. "The curtains are for your privacy," the translator explained in Japanese. "We were informed that communal showering was causing distress. This should help. Each of you can now bathe privately." There was a long moment of stunned silence. Then Fumiko, standing near the front of the group, stepped forward slowly. She reached out and touched one of the curtains, as if to verify it was real. The canvas was rough under her fingers, but sturdy. She pulled it closed, sealing herself into a private space. From inside, her voice came out, high and breaking with emotion. "They did this for us," she said in Japanese. "They actually did this for us." The women began to cry. Not quiet tears this time, but open sobbing. They moved into the shower stalls one by one, pulling the curtains closed behind them, and many of them simply stood there for long moments, overwhelmed by the implications of this simple act. Someone had listened to their distress. Someone had recognized their shame. Someone had cared enough to make a change. The Americans had installed these curtains not because they had to, not because it was required by any regulation, but because it was the right thing to do, because the women's dignity mattered. Keiko stood in her private stall, hot water streaming over her shoulders, and felt something break inside her. All the certainty, all the propaganda, all the beliefs she had held about the enemy, they shattered like glass. These people were not monsters. They were not barbarians. They were decent. They were capable of kindness, of empathy, of seeing their prisoners as human beings deserving of respect. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere had changed completely. The women talked quietly but animatedly, processing what had happened. Some still struggled with it. The contradiction was too great, the shift in understanding too dramatic. But others, like Fumiko, seemed almost relieved, as if they had been given permission to stop hating, to stop fearing, to start seeing their captors as something other than demons. "How did they know?" someone asked. "How did they know we were distressed?" "Someone must have noticed," another replied. "Someone must have cared enough to notice." Memory collided with reality. It was not cruelty, but simple human decency that cut the deepest. Kindness, it turned out, was far more powerful than any weapon. Keiko began keeping a diary in the second week. She wrote on paper provided by the camp administration. They had asked if the women wanted writing materials, and many had said yes. The paper was good quality, the pencil sharp. Even these small supplies spoke to an abundance that Japan had not known for years. Her first entry was tentative, carefully worded, as if someone might read it and judge her for her thoughts. "We are prisoners of war," she wrote. "We are being held by the enemy. But I do not know how to reconcile what I was told with what I experience. We were taught that Americans were cruel, that they would treat us worse than animals. We were told that capture meant humiliation, torture, death. Yet I am fed better here than I was fed when serving my own country. I sleep in a clean bed. I am treated with basic respect. Yesterday they installed privacy curtains in the shower room because someone noticed we were uncomfortable. Who are these people? What kind of enemy does such things?" She paused, staring at what she had written. Even putting these thoughts on paper felt like betrayal. She was Japanese. She was supposed to hate the enemy until her last breath. She was supposed to long for death rather than accept kindness from those who had defeated her nation. But she couldn't hate them. She tried. She wanted to maintain that clarity, that certainty of purpose. Hate was simple. Hate was easy. You knew where you stood when you could hate your enemy without reservation. Kindness was complicated. Kindness demanded that you see your enemy as human, with all the messy implications that carried. If they were human, if they were capable of decency and compassion, then what did that make the war? What did that make all the suffering, all the death? Lieutenant Martinez had given Keiko a small gift the previous day, a chocolate bar from her personal rations. She had simply placed it on the medical supply counter where Keiko was working, smiled, and walked away. No explanation, no expectation of thanks. Just a small act of kindness from one person to another. Keiko had stared at that chocolate bar for a full minute, unable to process the gesture. Then she had carefully unwrapped it and taken a small bite. It was sweet, rich, delicious, better than any candy she had tasted before the war. And with each bite, she felt her old beliefs crumbling a little more. She returned to her diary and wrote, "To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts, it is harder than any torture could be. Hatred is a fortress that keeps the world simple, but they give us soap, food, privacy, respect, and these things slip past all defenses. They force us to see them as human. And if they are human, then everything we believed, everything we were taught, everything we fought for, what was it all for?" She closed the diary and hid it under her mattress. Some thoughts were too dangerous to leave lying around, even here where no one could read Japanese. Not all the women struggled with the same questions. Some clung fiercely to their old beliefs, interpreting every American kindness as a trick, a manipulation, a strategy to make them betray their country. They ate the food but said it was poisoned with subtle chemicals meant to weaken their will. They accepted the clean beds but said it was just to make them soft before the real cruelty began. They saw the privacy curtains as an elaborate deception rather than an act of respect. These women, mostly older, mostly from more traditional backgrounds, gathered together in the barracks at night and whispered among themselves. They reinforced each other's certainty, shored up the crumbling walls of their hatred. But the younger women, women like Fumiko and several of the other nurses and radio operators, found those walls harder to maintain. They had seen the world a bit more, had been educated in modern schools where Western ideas had filtered in despite the government's best efforts to control information. They were more willing to question, more able to adapt. Late one night, about 3 weeks into their captivity, a group of women gathered near Keiko's bed. They spoke in whispers, careful not to wake those who were sleeping, and more importantly, careful not to be overheard by those who would condemn them for what they were discussing. "I received another letter from my sister," said Yuki, a former telegraph operator. "She says they are being treated well by the occupation forces. American soldiers share food with children. They are helping to rebuild. She says it is not what she expected." "My uncle wrote something similar," added another woman. "He said the Americans are distributing food in Tokyo, that they are setting up medical clinics. He said they are behaving more like administrators than conquerors." Fumiko spoke next, her voice barely audible. "What if we were wrong? What if everything we were told was a lie?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. It was the question they had all been thinking but were afraid to speak aloud. Because once you asked it, once you really considered it, there was no going back. You couldn't unhear that question. "Our leaders told us the Americans were demons," Keiko said slowly. "They told us that surrender meant unspeakable horrors. But I work alongside American nurses every day, and they are not demons. They are women doing their jobs, trying to help people. They are kind to me. They treat me as a colleague." "But what does it mean?" someone asked. "If we were lied to about this, what else did they lie about? What about the war itself? What about the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere? What about our divine mission?" No one had answers. They sat in the darkness, each wrestling with questions that shook the foundations of their entire worldview. Everything they had believed about themselves, their country, their purpose, all of it was being called into question by simple acts of human decency from people who were supposed to be monsters. "I think," Keiko said finally, "that we were taught to see them as less than human so it would be easier to fight them. But they have not been taught the same about us. Or if they were, they chose not to believe it. They look at us and see people, and that is something I cannot understand. How do you show humanity to someone you were at war with just weeks ago?" "Perhaps," Fumiko said quietly. "That is the difference between them and us. Perhaps that is why they won. So that is why." The turning point came during the 4th week, when several of the women were granted permission to attend a church service in the camp chapel. It was entirely voluntary. No one was forced or even encouraged to attend. The announcement was simply made that services were held every Sunday for anyone interested, prisoners and American personnel alike. Keiko was curious. She had learned some about Christianity in school before the war. It was a Western religion, viewed with some suspicion by the Japanese government, but not entirely forbidden. She had never attended a service, but something drew her to go. Perhaps it was a desire to understand her captors better. Perhaps it was simple boredom with the routine of camp life, or perhaps it was something deeper, a need to find meaning in the chaos of her shattered beliefs. She entered the chapel with a dozen other Japanese women, all of them nervous and uncertain. The chapel was a simple building with wooden benches and a small altar at the front. Sunlight streamed through the windows. American soldiers and personnel sat in the pews, and they made room for the Japanese women without comment or hostility. A few even smiled in welcome. The chaplain was an older man with gray hair and a gentle face. He spoke in English, but a translator stood beside him, rendering his words into Japanese. The sermon was about forgiveness, about loving your enemies, about recognizing the humanity in all people regardless of nationality or creed. Keiko listened with growing amazement. The chaplain spoke directly about the war, about the suffering on both sides, about the need to move forward with compassion rather than revenge. He quoted from the Christian Bible, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." It was a radical message, especially given the context. These were men whose brothers, friends, and comrades had died fighting against Japan, yet here was their spiritual leader telling them to love their enemies, to see them as fellow humans deserving of compassion. After the service, as people filed out of the chapel, Lieutenant Martinez approached Keiko. She had been sitting a few rows ahead during the service. "Did you understand?" Sarah asked in her careful, simple English. When Keiko looked confused, Sarah made gestures and tried again. The words, "Did you understand?" Keiko nodded slowly. "Some," she said in halting English. It was one of her first attempts to speak the language. "Forgiveness, love enemy." Sarah smiled. "Yes, hard to do, but important." She paused, searching for words. "You are not my enemy. War is enemy. You are person, like me." The simple statement hit Keiko like a physical blow. "You are not my enemy. You are person, like me." That night she wrote in her diary, "Today I began to understand. The Americans do not hate us. They pity us. They see us as victims of the same war that victimized them. They separate the people from the government, the individuals from the ideology. This is something we were never taught to do. We were taught that every American was our enemy, that they all wanted to destroy us. But these people do not want to destroy us. They want to feed us, care for us, and send us home when it is safe to do so. They want us to heal." She paused, then wrote one more line. "If the enemy values our humanity more than our own leaders did, what does that say about us? What does it say about our nation?" The questions were becoming clearer, even if the answers remained elusive. But one truth was becoming undeniable. Everything they had been taught about the Americans was wrong. Not just partially wrong, not just exaggerated, fundamentally, completely wrong. The Americans were not barbarians. They were not demons. They were people with a different way of seeing the world, a way that valued individual dignity, that recognized common humanity across lines of nation and race, that believed in treating even enemies with a basic level of respect and decency. And that realization was more devastating than any military defeat could ever be. The moment of complete transformation came quietly, without drama or fanfare. It happened in the infirmary on a rainy afternoon in October, 6 weeks into their captivity. An American soldier had been brought in with a minor injury, a twisted ankle from a training exercise on another part of the island. He was young, maybe 20 years old, with sandy hair and nervous eyes. He sat on the examination table while Lieutenant Martinez checked his ankle, and Keiko assisted by handing her supplies and taking notes. The young soldier kept glancing at Keiko, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke in English to Lieutenant Martinez. "Ma'am, is it okay that she's Japanese. My brother died at Iwo Jima." Keiko understood enough to grasp the meaning. This soldier had lost a brother fighting against her country. He had every reason to hate her, to see her as the enemy, to want nothing to do with her. Lieutenant Martinez finished wrapping the ankle and looked up at the young man. Her voice was firm but kind. "She's a nurse, Private. She's a professional. The war is over. What she is now is someone trying to do her job and get home to her family, same as you. Your brother's sacrifice wasn't so you could keep hating. It was so we could build something better than hate." The young soldier looked at Keiko then, really looked at her for the first time. She met his eyes, seeing the grief and anger there, but also something else. Recognition. Recognition that she was human. Recognition that she had probably lost people too. Recognition that they were both just caught in something bigger than themselves. He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Then to Keiko, in halting, careful words, "Thank you. For helping." Keiko bowed slightly, the Japanese gesture of respect automatic. "You are welcome," she managed in English. After the soldier left, Lieutenant Martinez turned to Keiko. They had been working together for weeks now, and a tentative friendship had developed despite the language barrier. Sarah reached out and gently touched Keiko's arm. "You are good nurse," Sarah said clearly. "Good person. Not enemy. Friend." Keiko felt tears spring to her eyes. She had been holding everything together for so long, the fear, the confusion, the guilt, the gradual crumbling of every belief she had ever held. And this simple declaration of friendship from someone who had every reason to hate her broke through the last of her defenses. "I thought you would hate me," Keiko said in Japanese, knowing Sarah wouldn't fully understand but needing to say it anyway. "I thought all Americans would hate all Japanese. That is what I was taught. But you have shown me only kindness. You have treated me like a human being. And I do not know how to reconcile this with everything I believed." Sarah seemed to understand the emotion, even if not all the words. She pulled Keiko into a gentle hug, a very American gesture that initially made Keiko stiffen in surprise. But then she relaxed into it, accepting the comfort, accepting the friendship, accepting that everything she thought she knew about the world had been wrong. That night, Keiko wrote in her diary, "Today I realize something that terrifies me. The enemy has been kinder to me than my own government ever was. They feed me better, house me better, treat me with more respect. They installed privacy curtains because they cared about our dignity. They offer friendship despite having every reason to hate us. An American nurse called me her friend today, and I believed her." She paused, staring at the words on the page. Then she wrote the most dangerous thought of all. What if we were the bad ones? What if Japan was wrong? What if everything we fought for was built on lies and our leaders sacrificed us for nothing? What if the Americans are not just stronger than us, but better than us? Not because they won the war, but because of how they treat those they defeated? She closed the diary and held it against her chest, overwhelmed by the weight of these realizations. Around her, in the darkened barracks, other women slept. Some peacefully, having made their own peace with their new understanding. Others restlessly, still fighting against the truth. But the truth was becoming undeniable. The Americans had won more than a military victory. They had won something far more profound. They had demonstrated that it was possible to be strong without being cruel, to be victorious without being vengeful, to have power and still choose mercy. And for women who had been taught that strength meant domination, that victory required cruelty, that mercy was weakness, this lesson was revolutionary. It changed not just how they saw Americans, but how they saw the world, how they saw their own country, and ultimately how they saw themselves. In November, word came that repatriation would begin soon. The women would be sent back to Japan in stages, starting in December. The announcement should have brought joy. They were going home. But instead it brought a complex mixture of emotions that many struggled to articulate. Keiko sat on her bed in the barracks, holding the notice in her hands, and felt nothing but dread. Going home meant returning to ruins, to starvation, to a defeated nation struggling to survive. Going home meant leaving behind regular meals, clean beds, and people who treated her with respect. Going home meant facing the judgment of those who would see her as tainted by her time with the enemy. "I should want to go home," Fumiko said quietly, sitting beside her. "I should be counting the days, but I'm afraid. Is that wrong? Am I a traitor for being afraid to leave?" "I think many of us feel the same," Keiko replied. "We are afraid of what we will find there. We are afraid of how we have changed. We are afraid that our families will not recognize us, not because of how we look, but because of who we have become." The women had changed. 6 weeks of adequate food had restored color to their faces, strength to their bodies. They no longer looked like the desperate, frightened prisoners who had arrived in September, but the changes went far deeper than the physical. They had seen a different way of living, a different way of treating people, a different way of being in the world, and they could not unsee it. "What will we tell them?" another woman asked. "How do we explain that we were treated well? That the Americans were kind? Will they believe us? Will they think we have been brainwashed?" It was a valid concern. The truth of their experience might sound like collaboration to those who had not lived it. The kindness they received might be interpreted as weakness or betrayal. How do you explain to someone who has only known propaganda that the reality was completely different? The first group of women departed on a cold December morning. Keiko was not among them. The nurses would go in a later group once their assistance in the infirmary was no longer needed. But she stood with the others at the dock, watching as Fumiko and 60 other women boarded the ship that would take them back to Japan. Fumiko had cried when they said goodbye. "I don't want to go," she had whispered. "But I must see my family. I must know they are alive." Then she had pulled back and looked at Keiko with eyes that held a new wisdom, a hard-won understanding. "Tell Lieutenant Martinez thank you. Tell her she changed everything for me. Tell her I will remember the kindness." As the ship pulled away from the dock, Keiko thought about what awaited those women. Japan was under occupation now. American troops controlled the major cities. General MacArthur was running the country, implementing reforms, rebuilding infrastructure. From the letters that continued to arrive, it seemed the occupation was going better than anyone had expected. The Americans were providing food aid, medical supplies, and helping to rebuild. But it was still a defeated nation. Still a place of rubble and hardship. Still a country trying to come to terms with the enormity of its loss, and the lies it had been told by its leaders. The women returning would carry with them a secret knowledge, a truth that many in Japan would not want to hear. The Americans were not monsters. The enemy they had been taught to hate unto death was, in fact, more humane than their own government had been. How do you rebuild a national identity around that truth? Keiko was in the final group to leave, departing in late December. Before she left, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez gave her a gift, a small photo of the two of them together, taken by another nurse with a borrowed camera. In the photo, they stood side by side in front of the infirmary, both smiling. Two women from nations that had been at war just months earlier, now friends. Sarah had written on the back in English, "To Keiko, my friend and colleague, may you find peace in your homeland. Remember that the war does not define us. Our choices do. We choose kindness. Sarah, December 1945. Keiko couldn't read all of it, but another prisoner who spoke better English translated. She held the photo carefully, knowing it was precious beyond measure. It was proof. Proof that what she experienced was real. Proof that the enemy could be kind. Proof that everything changed in those few months on Angel Island. On the ship back to Japan, Keiko stood at the railing and watched America disappear behind her. She thought about the privacy curtains, about Lieutenant Martinez's friendship, about the chaplain's sermon on loving your enemies, about the young soldier who had lost his brother but chose to say thank you anyway. She thought about how she arrived expecting hell and found something else entirely. Not paradise, it was still captivity, still displacement, still the result of a terrible war. But it was bearable, and more than that, it was educational. It taught her that the world was more complex than she had been told, that people were more complicated than propaganda allowed, and that sometimes the greatest strength was shown not in crushing your enemies, but in treating them with dignity when you had every right to show cruelty. Years later, when she was an old woman telling her grandchildren about the war, the story of the privacy curtains was what she told them. Not the battles, not the destruction, not the fear, but this small act of unexpected kindness that changed everything. We were prisoners, she would tell them. We were the enemy. They owed us nothing but basic survival. But instead they gave us dignity. They saw us as human beings who deserved respect. And that simple act of hanging curtains in a shower room taught me more about strength, about civilization, about what it means to be truly powerful than anything else I learned in my entire life. Real power, she would say, is having the ability to be cruel and choosing kindness instead. That is what the Americans taught me. And that is what I have tried to teach you. And so the privacy curtains became more than just fabric and metal rods. They became a symbol of a truth that many in both nations needed to learn. That even in the darkest conflicts, humanity can persist. That treating your enemy with dignity does not make you weak, it makes you civilized. That small acts of kindness can have profound impacts that echo across generations. For 127 Japanese women who arrived at Angel Island in September 1945 expecting degradation and finding respect. Instead, those curtains represented a turning point, not just in their captivity, but in their understanding of the world. They came as prisoners of war and left as witnesses to a different way of being, a way that valued human dignity above revenge, that saw individuals rather than just enemies. The story spread. When the women returned to Japan, they told others what they experienced. And though some didn't believe them, though some accused them of being brainwashed or sympathizers, the truth slowly spread. The Americans were not what they had been told. The enemy was capable of unexpected decency. This realization helped shape post-war Japan in ways that are still visible today. It made possible the reconciliation between the two nations, the rebuilding of trust, the transformation of enemies into allies. It all started with people choosing, even in small ways, to see the humanity in those they had been taught to hate. As Keiko wrote in her final diary entry before leaving Angel Island, the curtains were just canvas, but they changed everything. Because they proved that even in war, even between enemies, there are people who choose kindness. And that choice makes all the difference. And that is a story worth remembering. If you found this account meaningful, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. These moments of humanity in the midst of terrible conflict remind us of who we can choose to be, even in the darkest times. History is not just about the battles we fought, it's about the choices we made when we had the power to be cruel and chose kindness instead.